On Zombie Reddit, today's story is...
My narcissistic family despised me for 28 years, but when my aunt left me her $1 million inheritance, I made them pay with the most epic humiliation they could ever have imagined. I never spent much time thinking about my Aunt Lydia. As my mother's older sister, although she was always present in the background during my life, we never developed a close relationship. My parents described her as the eccentric of the family, independent, peculiar, and stubbornly self-sufficient. During my childhood years, we only met at family gatherings. She wasn't particularly affectionate, but she wasn't unpleasant either. My parents always said that she preferred them, showering them with expensive gifts and support when they needed it. They talked as if they had Aunt Lydia completely under their influence. So when Aunt Lydia passed away last month, I didn't expect to be significantly involved. I assumed my parents would take care of all the arrangements and, as usual, would brag about the inheritance they would receive. I didn't even attend the funeral, as it was held in another state, and I couldn't afford the time off or the travel expenses. To be honest, I didn't feel much grief at her loss. How could I, when I had always kept such a distance? Imagine my surprise when I received a letter from her lawyer a week later. At first I thought it must be a mistake. The envelope was thick, sealed with an official stamp and addressed specifically to me. I opened it with some hesitation, quickly reading the legal terminology until my eyes stopped at the section that made me feel dizzy. Aunt Lydia had left me her entire inheritance, all of her assets. I reread the words several times, unable to assimilate it. There had to be some kind of mistake. Why would she leave anything to me? And even less so, everything she owned. I was just her niece, someone she barely recognized at meetings. I wasn't even an active part of her life. The only people remotely close to her, if they could even be considered as such, were my parents. I immediately called the lawyer to clarify the situation. He confirmed it without hesitation. My aunt had updated her 5 years ago, naming me as the sole beneficiary. She had assets valued at a considerable fortune, a paid-off house, substantial savings, various investments, and several personal items of significant value. She explained that she had left specific instructions for me to take the necessary time and decide what to do with everything, but that ultimately it all belonged to me. For a moment, I was completely paralyzed. These things don't happen to people like me. I was a 28-year-old struggling to survive, working 2 part-time jobs just to keep my head above water. My parents had never supported me, either financially or emotionally. I had spent most of my life feeling like an afterthought in my own family. And suddenly, I was holding a lifeline in my hands that could change everything. The euphoria didn't last long. My parents found out almost immediately. It all started with a phone call from my mother. She sounded strangely cheerful, almost jubilant, asking me how I was and if I had received any interesting news lately. I knew she was already aware. I could tell from her tone of voice. I replied cautiously, admitting that I had received a letter from Aunt Lydia's lawyer. Her response was instantaneous. She laughed and commented that it was about time Aunt Lydia put her affairs in order. She asked directly how much the inheritance was worth, assuming that I had no right to claim it. When I hesitated to answer, her pressure increased. Her voice became sharp as she demanded to know exactly what the lawyer had told me. I told her the truth. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, followed by a verbal explosion. He accused me of lying, of trying to swindle the family out of what was rightfully theirs. I could hear my father shouting in the background, his voice muffled but clearly furious. They both railed about how Aunt Lydia would never do such a thing, how it must be a mistake, and how I had no right to keep money that belonged to them. She was our sister, not yours. My mother spat, her voice trembling with anger. You have no right to her inheritance. She only left it to you because you manipulated her somehow. You better do the right thing and hand it over. Family comes first. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Manipulated? I had barely had any communication with Aunt Lydia. I reminded my mother of that fact, but she showed no interest in logic. She kept repeating that it wasn't fair, that Aunt Lydia must have been confused when she wrote the will, and that I owed it to them to correct this injustice. The following days became a whirlwind of phone calls, text messages, and even an unexpected visit from my parents. They weren't just annoyed. They were furious. My father demanded that I hand over the inheritance immediately, claiming that it was his birthright. He kept mentioning how hard they had worked to raise me, how much they had sacrificed, and how ungrateful I was for even considering keeping the money. I tried to stay calm, but her constant harassment was exhausting. Every time I stood my ground, they intensified their guilt tactics. They said I was destroying the family, that I was being greedy, and that I would regret it if I didn't do the right thing. At one point, my father declared, "You think this money is yours, but it's not. It's ours. She was our sister, not yours. What would people think of you if they knew you were stealing from your own parents?" I was stunned. Rob. The audacity was almost laughable, but there was nothing funny about the way they were treating me. For the first time, I saw clearly how arrogant and manipulative they could be. I didn't have the energy to continue arguing, so I told them I needed time to reflect. That wasn't enough for them, but it was the only way I could get them to leave my apartment. After they left, I sat down and cried, not because I felt guilty, because I wasn't, but because I realized how little they valued me as a person. This inheritance wasn't just about money. It was an opportunity for me to live a stable life. No matter how hard they tried to make me feel guilty, I wasn't going to let them take it away from me. As I wiped away my tears and took a deep breath, I made a decision. If they thought they could intimidate and subdue me, they were about to find out how wrong they were. Update 1. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of missed calls and text messages from my parents. My mother had even left several voicemails, each one more dramatic than the last. In one, he was sobbing, saying he couldn't believe how he was betraying the family. In another, his voice sounded cold and cutting, accusing me of being selfish and ungrateful. My father had left a shorter but angrier message, threatening to get lawyers involved if I didn't fix this. I ignored it all. Instead of responding, I concentrated on contacting Aunt Lydia's lawyer again. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before the situation escalated any further. The lawyer, Mr. Clark, was patient and professional, explaining everything to me in detail. Aunt Lydia's will was legally sound, and she had left clear instructions about her intentions. She wanted me, and only me, to inherit her estate. When I asked him why she had chosen me, he hesitated briefly before answering. He said that Aunt Lydia had spoken very favorably of me in their meetings, describing me as hardworking and kind. Apparently, she had been closely following my life over the years, even though we had not developed a close relationship. I was completely taken aback. All those times I thought she was distant and indifferent, she had actually been paying attention to my life. Mr. Clark added that Aunt Lydia had been disappointed by how my parents treated me. She felt they were arrogant and contemptuous, and didn't appreciate the sacrifices she had made to support me. It was too much information to process all at once. I had spent my whole life feeling ignored and undervalued, but here was someone who had silently observed my struggles and wanted to make a difference. This thought brought tears to my eyes. After the call, I felt a renewed sense of determination. Aunt Lydia had chosen me for a specific reason, and I wasn't going to let my parents intimidate me into giving up their legacy. But confronting them was not going to be easy. That same afternoon, I received another knock on my door. This time it was my older cousin, Sarah, whom I hadn't seen in years. I had always been my parents' favorite niece, their golden girl. Throughout my childhood, I was constantly compared to her, how attractive she was, how intelligent, how successful. I wasn't surprised that she had been sent to talk to me. Sarah wasted no time getting straight to the point. She mentioned that she had heard about Aunt Lydia's will and wanted to help me see sense. She claimed that my parents were devastated and that I was being cruel by refusing to share the inheritance with them. She said that my mother had been crying nonstop and that my father was losing sleep over what he considered a betrayal. Then she leaned towards me, her tone dripping with condescension, and said it wasn't too late to fix things. "You have to understand," Sarah told me. Aunt Lydia was probably confused. She probably didn't realize the tension this would cause in the family. "You don't want to be the cause of a permanent rift, do you?" I couldn't help but laugh. I asked her if my parents had ever considered how their behavior might have affected me. Had they thought about the rift they created when they constantly belittled me, ignored my needs, and made me feel insignificant? Sarah seemed uncomfortable, but she continued to insist. She said I was being too emotional and needed to think logically. She even suggested that I give my parents a reasonable share of the inheritance to keep the family peace. It was infuriating. She was treating me like a child who didn't understand the consequences of their actions, when in fact I understood them perfectly well. My parents had spent years undermining my confidence, making me feel small, and now they wanted me to hand over the one thing that could finally provide me with some independence. I told Sarah that I wasn't interested in negotiating. Aunt Lydia's will was clear, and I had no intention of contradicting her wishes. If my parents had a problem with that, they could take it up with the lawyer directly. Sarah left muttering something about how I was making a big mistake. I didn't care at all. The following days were disturbingly quiet. My parents stopped calling and texting, and for a moment I thought that maybe they had decided to give up. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't be the case. And sure enough, the calm didn't last long. One morning I woke up to an avalanche of notifications on my phone. My mother had posted a long, emotional tirade on Facebook, accusing me of stealing the inheritance and tearing the family apart. She presented herself as the victim, claiming that Aunt Lydia had been mentally unstable when she wrote the will and that I was taking advantage of her confusion. The post was full of falsehoods, but that didn't really matter. My parents' friends and extended family members immediately came to her defense, flooding the comments with messages of support. They called me greedy, selfish, and heartless, saying that I was betraying my own parents for money. It was utterly humiliating. I hadn't even told most of the people about the inheritance, and now my personal affairs were being publicly exposed. At first I felt a wave of panic. I didn't know how to respond, or if I should respond at all. But as I read the comments, something shifted inside me. These people didn't really know me. They didn't know the sacrifices I had made to survive, or the years of emotional neglect I had endured at the hands of my parents. They were judging me based on a completely one-sided narrative, and I realized that I didn't owe them anything at all. Not an explanation, not an apology, nothing at all. Instead of interacting with the publication, I called Mr. Clark again. I explained the situation and asked for his professional advice. He assured me that my parents had no legal right to the inheritance, no matter how much noise they made. He also suggested that I meticulously document everything, every call, text message, and visit, in case they tried to escalate the situation further. His calm, practical approach helped me to focus. I couldn't control what my parents said or did, but I could control how I responded. I decided to block my mother on Facebook and set my profile to private. I also contacted some close friends to let them know what was happening, so they wouldn't be caught off guard by the family drama. Their support meant the world to me. The next time my parents tried to contact me, I was prepared. I didn't answer their calls, but I sent them a text message informing them that any further communication would have to go through Mr. Clark. They didn't take it well as expected. My father sent an angry reply, accusing me of being disrespectful and threatening to exclude me from the family forever. My mother followed up with a tearful voicemail message, begging me to reconsider my position, but I wasn't going to budge. For the first time, I felt like I was in control of the situation. Update 2. The fallout from my mother's Facebook rant quickly escalated. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years sent me messages asking what was going on, while distant relatives joined the controversy, some to criticize me and others to support me. After careful consideration, I realized that this was exactly what my parents were looking for: control through public humiliation. I absolutely refused to give them that satisfaction. After consulting again with Mr. Clark, we decided to take legal action. He suggested filing a defamation lawsuit against my parents, considering the obvious falsehoods they had spread online. It wasn't about the money. Aunt Lydia's inheritance had left me more than sufficiently secure. It was about setting clear boundaries and showing that they couldn't intimidate me into submission. When I gave my approval, Mr. Clark acted quickly. A formal notification was sent to my parents, detailing the defamatory statements they had made and demanding a public retraction along with an apology. If they refused, we would proceed with a formal lawsuit in court. Predictably, my parents reacted with fury. My mother called me completely hysterical, screaming about how I was destroying the family. My father left a scathing voicemail accusing me of having no heart and warning me that I would regret my actions. I did not respond to either of them. Then came the begging phase. A few days later, Sarah showed up at my door unannounced, her usual confident demeanor replaced by an obvious nervousness. She tried to make me feel guilty, claiming that suing my parents was crossing an unacceptable line and that I should consider how this was affecting her health. I was completely unmoved. I told her that if they were so concerned about his health, they should have considered the consequences of their actions before spreading lies about me on the internet. Sarah didn't like my response. She changed tack, arguing that I was overreacting and that the family could resolve this matter privately. She even suggested that she could get my parents to apologize to me personally instead of subjecting them to the humiliation of a public apology. I laughed bitterly and told her it was too late for that. For years they had treated me as an afterthought, dismissing my feelings and prioritizing their own desires. Now they were finally facing the consequences of their behavior, and I wasn't going to back down. When Sarah realized that I was not going to change my mind, she tried one last desperate move. She mentioned Aunt Lydia, suggesting that she would not have wanted this kind of family conflict. I interrupted her immediately, reminding her that Aunt Lydia had left me her fortune for a specific reason. I was not going to allow anyone to disrespect her memory by turning her last wishes into a bargaining chip. The next day, Mr. Clark informed me that my parents wanted to reach an out-of-court settlement. They had realized that they did not have a solid defense and were eager to avoid the embarrassment of a public court case. I expected them to try to negotiate, but surprisingly they accepted Mr. Clark's conditions with virtually no resistance. The conditions were simple. They had to issue a public apology on social media, retracting their false statements and acknowledging the damage they had caused. In addition, they would pay me $4,000 in damages, not because I needed the money, but as a symbolic gesture to show that their actions had real consequences. But I wasn't finished. I told Mr. Clark that I had one additional condition. If Sarah wanted to play the role of mediator, she could start by apologizing to me personally, and I didn't want a half-hearted apology. I wanted her to get on her knees. Mr. Clark was surprised, but agreed to include this demand in the agreement. My reasoning was simple. Sarah had spent years bullying me, making derogatory comments about my appearance, my decisions, and my achievements. She had always been my parents' golden girl, despite being only their niece, basking in their praise while I was treated like an outsider. If she wanted to defend them so enthusiastically, she could show me the same level of humility that they were being forced to show. When Sarah found out about my demand, she was completely enraged. She called me shouting about how humiliating it would be, accusing me of being vindictive. I replied that she was free to refuse if she didn't want to apologize, but in that case I wouldn't proceed with the agreement. If she intended to meddle in my life and take my parents' side, she needed to understand that her actions also had consequences. Finally, he agreed. The formal apology took place a week later in my lawyer's office. My parents looked completely defeated as they handed me the signed settlement agreement. My mother's eyes were red from crying, and my father avoided any eye contact. Mr. Clark meticulously reviewed the documents to make sure everything was in order before nodding in my direction. Sarah stood to one side, her arms firmly crossed over her chest. She looked like she wanted to be anywhere but there. When it was her turn, she hesitated momentarily, looking to my parents for support. My father gave her a small nod of approval, and she walked forward with obvious reluctance. I told her directly to kneel. Her face flushed with anger, but she made no verbal protest. Slowly, she lowered herself to the floor, her eyes burning with resentment. She mumbled an apology, her voice barely audible. I told her to speak up, and then she repeated her words more clearly, saying that she deeply regretted the way she had treated me and for siding with my parents. She admitted that her actions had been hurtful and that she had been wrong to belittle my feelings. It was a small victory, but it felt hugely significant. For the first time, I was not the one being belittled or dismissed. For the first time, I was the one with the power. After the apology concluded, I got up and left without looking back. I didn't need to hear her excuses or justifications. I had spent my whole life trying to win their approval, but now I clearly understood that their opinions didn't really matter. The important thing was that I had finally managed to stand up for myself. The public apology appeared on my parents' social media accounts that same day. It was carefully worded, no doubt with the assistance of their lawyer, but it was enough to clear my name. They admitted to spreading false information and acknowledged that their actions had caused me significant harm. The agreed payment of $4,000 was deposited into my account shortly afterwards. It was a negligible amount compared to Aunt Lydia's inheritance, but it was never about the money. It was about showing that I was no longer going to be intimidated. As for Sarah, she avoided me completely after the apology. I heard through other relatives that she felt deeply ashamed by the whole affair, but honestly I didn't care. I had actively participated in my parents' toxic behavior for years, and it was time for me to face the consequences. With the legal drama finally resolved, I was finally able to experience a true sense of peace. Aunt Lydia's inheritance had provided me with much more than financial security. It had given me the strength to stand up for myself and demand the respect I deserved. Update 3. When Aunt Lydia left me her entire fortune, it wasn't just money, it was a vote of confidence. She believed in me to do the right thing, to use her legacy in a way that would really matter. I did not take that responsibility lightly. Aunt Lydia had been an eccentric, fiercely independent woman who deeply valued integrity, loyalty, and true family, qualities that my parents never seemed to truly understand. I wanted to honor her in a way that reflected who she was and the values she stood for. At first, I wasn't entirely sure what to do. The figures were overwhelming. While some of the money was tied up in various investments, there was still an extraordinary amount at my immediate disposal. I had no intention of wasting it on superfluous luxuries. Aunt Lydia would not have approved of such behavior, and besides, it didn't seem right. I had spent so many years carefully economizing, budgeting every penny carefully, that the idea of reckless spending made me deeply uncomfortable. One of the first decisions I made was to secure my own financial future. I paid off all my outstanding debts, including student loans, credit cards, and the small mortgage I had on my modest house. Knowing that I was completely debt-free was a huge weight off my shoulders. I also set up a substantial emergency fund, making sure that I would never have to worry about unexpected expenses again. Next, I turned my attention to Aunt Lydia's house. Her beautiful Victorian property had been the center of her life for decades. It needed some major repairs and renovations, but I couldn't bear the thought of selling it or allowing it to deteriorate. I hired a team of professionals to restore the house to its former glory, but I knew that this legacy was not just about my personal benefit. Aunt Lydia's life had been an example of quiet generosity, as Mr. Clark informed me. She had always contributed what she could, whether it was donating to local food banks, supporting women's shelters, or funding educational programs. Continuing that legacy of generosity seemed to me the most natural and meaningful way to honor her memory. I made substantial donations to the charities that Aunt Lydia had supported throughout her life. Local food banks received generous contributions, ensuring that families in need would not go hungry. I provided several women's shelters with essential funds to offer better resources, professional counseling, and safe spaces for survivors of domestic violence. One of the more personal donations went to a literacy program that helped adults learn to read. Aunt Lydia had volunteered there for years, and I remembered how passionately she spoke about the joy of seeing someone discover the world through books for the first time. Making a meaningful donation in her name felt like coming full circle with something she had loved deeply. When news spread about how I was using Aunt Lydia's fortune, I was not at all surprised to hear from my parents again. Their sense of entitlement knew no bounds, and they were not going to allow the inheritance to slip through their fingers without trying every possible angle. This time, they adopted a new tactic. They sent various relatives as intermediaries. It began with a voicemail from an aunt who barely spoke to me, even during the holidays. Her tone oozed false warmth as she mentioned how proud Aunt Lydia would be of the donations she had made. Then came the inevitable twist. My parents had mentioned that they were experiencing financial difficulties, she said. Wouldn't it be wonderful if I could extend some of Aunt Lydia's generosity to them? How absurd. Financial difficulties? Who were they trying to fool with such a story? I didn't bother to reply. The next day, a cousin I hadn't seen since I was a teenager sent me a long text message. She nostalgically recalled the time Aunt Lydia had taken us out for ice cream, and then subtly changed the conversation to mention that my parents were going through a difficult time. According to her, it was only fair that I should help them since they were still family. I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it for good. If these people thought they could manipulate me into handing over money with feelings of guilt, they were completely wrong. What really outraged me, however, was how they tried to use the concept of family as a weapon against me. Where was that deep sense of family when I grew up being ignored and belittled by my own parents? Where was it when I had to fend for myself completely? While my cousin Sarah was given attention and was constantly spoiled, now that I had something that they coveted, was I suddenly considered part of the family again? However, not all my relatives were the same. Some cousins, like Sophia, my father's niece, had always been genuinely kind to me. When I saw how hard Sophia was working to pay for her nursing studies, I decided to offer her my help. I contacted her directly, and we had a heart-to-heart talk. At first, she was hesitant to accept, but when I assured her that it came from Aunt Lydia's inheritance and had nothing to do with my parents, she accepted my offer with genuine gratitude. Sophia wasn't the only person I helped. I also supported my cousin Marcus, who had always stood up for me when we were children by paying his tuition at the technical school. Both showed sincere gratitude, and witnessing their enthusiasm and relief confirmed to me that I was using the inheritance in a meaningful way. Unsurprisingly, news that I was helping Sophia and Marcus quickly reached my parents, and that's when the calls and text messages started up again. My mother left me a voicemail where I could hear the tremor in her voice as she expressed her disbelief that I was providing financial support to cousins while my own parents were supposedly experiencing difficulties. He accused me of being selfish, ungrateful, and disrespectful to those who had raised me. My father's message was even more direct and confrontational. He demanded to know why I was helping distant relatives instead of supporting my immediate family. I didn't bother to reply to either of them. Their persistence did not diminish at all. They began to send me text messages daily, alternating between attempts to make me feel guilty and direct insults. My mother went so far as to claim that Aunt Lydia would have been ashamed of the way I was treating them. My father declared that I was a heartless daughter who would end up regretting abandoning my family. It was truly laughable. These were the same people who had systematically ignored me throughout my life, who had always favored Sarah even when she constantly bullied me, and who only considered me when they needed something. And now they had the audacity to call me heartless. Eventually, they took the situation a step further. My father called me one night, his voice filled with barely contained anger. He declared that if I didn't start providing them with financial support, they would have no choice but to inform everyone about how ungrateful and cruel I was being. With absolute calm, I asked him how the new country house they had just bought was. He was completely paralyzed in the middle of his speech. He began to stutter. I simply informed him that I would get back to my lawyer and ended the call. That was the last straw. I contacted my lawyer the following morning and explained the situation in detail. I described the incessant calls, the threatening text messages, and the way my parents were trying to get money out of me through other relatives. He listened patiently and then assured me that he would take care of the matter personally. Within a week, my lawyer had sent a formal warning to my parents. The letter detailed how their repeated attempts at harassment were completely unacceptable and that any further contact would result in immediate legal action. The document was clear, forceful, and left no room for misinterpretation. I received no further direct communication from them after that, although my aunt called me a few days later, absolutely furious. She claimed that I had gone too far by threatening legal action against my own parents. I calmly explained that I had no obligation to tolerate harassment, even from family members. If they couldn't respect my personal boundaries, I had every right to protect myself legally. I concluded by asking her if she wanted to be the next to receive a similar warning. My parents finally backed down, although not without one last attempt to present themselves as innocent victims. They posted a deliberately ambiguous message on social media about how ungrateful children forget the sacrifices made by their parents. They clearly hadn't learned their lesson. Some relatives intervened with apparently sympathetic comments, but others who knew the true situation openly defended me. Sophia even commented publicly that Aunt Lydia had made her intentions perfectly clear and that I was honoring her memory in the most appropriate way possible. Seeing their sincere defense moved me deeply. In the end, all my parents' strategies and manipulations were completely unsuccessful. They failed to pressure me into giving them what they coveted, and they failed to damage my reputation among the people who really mattered. I had finally achieved the peace and freedom necessary to live my life on my own terms, free from their toxic influence continuing to affect my well-being.